Thank everyone for joining us. This is the first public meeting of the Classical Forum for Contemporary Issues. Of course, I want to thank my co-organizers, Sophia Stone, Alexander Rosenthal, Pubal, Altai Koskin, Fiorenza Bevilacqua, and really all the members of the forum for many enjoyable hours of discussion and valuable advice. And I also thank Dr. Ricardo Gantz for helping me with this and so many other things. And a special thanks to Professor Jacob Howland of Austin University for agreeing to speak to us today. This group was formed in reaction to the massacre of Israelis on October 7th and the subsequent reactions to that around the world, especially on college campuses. I feel that tensions were simmering for many years, and that this event caused them to break out into the open and to really damage the fabric of our society and its academic institutions. There's an old custom among English-speaking people never to discuss politics and religion. I always found that a strange custom because how are people supposed to develop their thoughts about politics and religion if they can't talk about them? A great philosopher once said that there's can't be freedom of thought if there's no freedom of speech. And in today's context, it seems to me that silence is no longer an option. We need to relearn the skills of conversing about important subjects with respect, with honesty, and with compassion. The aim of this group is therefore to provide an opportunity for serious and humane discussion about these very difficult but unavoidable practical and theoretical issues that we all face today. I'm very happy to have such a wide variety of participants here from so many countries around the world. And I think we're really blessed to have Professor Jacob Howland as our guide for thinking about human affairs with the aid of classical literature, his books on Homer, on Plato, on the Talmud, and on political theory combine rigorous scholarship with an extraordinary ability to address the questions that face us all as human beings and citizens. Please, Jacob, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Gabrielle. And it's really an honor to be able to address such a distinguished and diverse group. And I very much appreciated your description of Classical Forum and why it was formed. I concur with everything you said. And so I'm just really excited to be able to speak to you all today. I titled my talk with a little bit of prodding from Gabrielle, Philosophy and Ideological Tyranny in Plato's Cleitophon, Lessons for Our Time. And let me just be clear, this is a talk, this is a work in progress. So I'm really excited to be able to think through my argument with all of you today. But first, let me say, why would we be talking about why would I want to talk about the Cleitophon to this strange little Platonic dialogue in an address to the Classical Forum? And it's because I believe that it speaks in some important ways to our contemporary situation. The Cleitophon dramatizes an encounter between an oligarchic politician, Cleitophon, and the philosopher Socrates. And it's just the two of them speaking to each other in this dialogue. And basically, here's a short overview. Cleitophon criticizes Socrates, and he says to him, look, you're terrific in exhorting people to virtue, but you don't deliver the goods. So you encourage people to pursue virtue, but you don't provide knowledge of what virtue is. And it's either because you don't know, which Cleitophon says toward the end of the dialogue, I don't believe that, or it's because you're just holding back. You're unwilling to share your knowledge. Now, this would mean, and Cleitophon doesn't state this explicitly, that Socrates is behaving unjustly. If he actually knows what virtue is, and of course he says it's the most important thing for human beings, why wouldn't he share it? And then the dialogue just ends. Socrates does not respond to his indictment. Now, I was looking at the Cleitophon some months ago, and I just had a little flash of inspiration. So my last book was called Glaucon's Fate, History, Myth, and Character in Plato's Republic. And I argued in that book that far from rescuing Glaucon from a life of tyranny, there's evidence that Glaucon, in fact, joined the 30 tyrants. and died fighting alongside Critias and Charmides, his own relatives, in the Battle of Munichia. Now, this I mentioned because it occurred to me in reading the Cleitophon that there's evidence in the Cleitophon that it is set probably at the beginning of the rule of the oligarchy known as the 30 Tyrants, after the end of the Peloponnesian War. And I'm going to argue that this dramatic date is crucial to understanding the dialogue. And there's, I think, very strong evidence that Cleitophon was involved, at least initially, with this ideological tyranny of the 30. And let me also add that some of the basic assumptions about knowledge and justice that were held by the 30 are echoed in our contemporary situation. So that's at least a kind of initial suggestion about how this dialogue might be relevant to what's happening today. Now, the dialogue begins and ends with various puzzles. First of all, it has a very strange opening speech, which I'll just read here in Clifford Orwin's translation. Socrates says, Cleitophon, the son of Aristonomus, as someone was just telling us, was conversing with Lysias and criticized spending time with Socrates, while he could not praise too highly the company of Thrasymachus. Now, it's a kind of odd speech. It has a kind of legal tone, right? Someone was just telling us that you were talking about me, right? Criticizing us. It sounds like an accusation. And I mean, one thing we might ask initially is, who's this us that Socrates is talking about? Cleitophon, the son of Aristonomus, was, as someone was just telling us, was conversing with Lysias. Well, I mean, obviously, one reasonable answer would be the circle of Socratics, right? But maybe there's more to that. I might return to that later. As I said, the beginning is odd, and I'll say something more about that in a bit. The ending is strange because Socrates doesn't answer the accusations. Why does it begin in such an odd way? And why does it end after Cleitophon presents an indictment of the philosopher with no response whatsoever from Socrates? So I hope to shed some light on these questions. Now, perhaps there's a clue to what's going on by in the fact of the four people who are named in the dialogue: Cleitophon, Lysias, Thrasymachus, and Socrates. All four, as you know, are present in Plato's Republic, which occurs under the shadow of the 30. I think that's pretty easy to establish. All the characters named in the Republic are historical persons. Niceratus, the son of Nicias, was executed by the 30. Polemarchus was executed by the 30. Lysias, of course, supplied money and arms to the exiled Democrats, and of course Socrates himself was subjected to trial and execution by returning Democrats. Now, if the historian Mark Munn is right in his book on Athens in the Age of Socrates, the location of the opening scene in the Republic, where Glaucon and Socrates are going back up to Athens and are stopped by the group from the Piraeus, is where the Battle of Munichia took place, where Critias and Charmides were killed, among others. So Cleitophon is present at the discussion in the Republic, and as you recall, he shows up very briefly. He's sort of on the circle of the Socratics, or sort of on the edge of the circle of Socratics, let's say, as he is in the Cleitophon. Now, what do we know about Cleitophon? He was an oligarch who was associated with Theramenes, who was executed by the 30. And we also know that the 30, of course, attacked Socrates. The 30 passed a law forbidding anyone to engage in the art of speech. And they passed a law, if you can call it that, aimed in particular at Socrates, that he was forbidden to speak with anyone under the age of 30. Now, in the Republic, Cleitophon rebukes Polemarchus. You remember there's this scene in the Republic where it's in book 1, and they're talking, and Polemarchus pipes up and interjects a comment about what Thrasymachus meant in the argument. And then Cleitophon interjects, if it's you who are to witness for him, Polemarchus. What you need to know about Cleitophon is he was a supporter of the so-called ancestral constitution. And the point of his remark is that Polemarchus, being a metic, a resident alien, um, doesn't have standing to speak. Um, so there's almost a kind of, I mean, he wouldn't have legal standing, let's say, in certain contexts, but that's the kind of rebuke here, right? He's a foreigner, you have no right to witness for Symmachus. Now, it's interesting because there we see him being on the side of restricting speech, right? Um, Polemarchus, from his point of view, does not have the standing to share his opinions, so he can't talk. I think that's significant because, of course, Polemarchus was targeted by the 30. And there's a sense in which we might see Cleitophon's hostility to Polemarchus as kind of foreshadowing the 30's murder of him. I think this might be Plato's way of sort of delicately marking Cleitophon as being part of this oligarchic circle around Critias. But anyway, to return to the first speech of Socrates after all those kind of conjectures and hypotheses, what it looks to me like that speech of Socrates, where again he says, Cleitophon, the son of Aristodemus, as someone was just telling us, was conversing with Lysias and criticized spending time with Socrates, while he could not praise too highly the company of Thrasymachus. It's a very oddly worded speech. It's a very strange speech. I suspect, at least I'm going to throw this out, that it looks like something the 30 might say. That is, it's a kind of imitation of the conduct and language of the 30, maybe a sort of Socratic mockery, um, uh, which would come not from the, let's say, illegitimate authority of the 30, um, however legally legitimate they might have been. And of course, there's debates about this, but I just mean, these guys are tyrants. They executed 1,500 of their fellow Athenians. It's coming from a place of real authority, which is philosophical and free. And if it is a kind of mockery, it would be kind of defying the oligarchy that has taken power, defying the political masters. Now, I should say, incidentally, that I will point out in a second or minute why I think this, if this is situated during the time of the 30, it has to be early. Let's leave that hanging for a second here. But I wonder whether Cleitophon was speaking to Lysias, because in the opening speech he says, I heard you were talking to Lysias, to warn him off Socrates. I don't know. So these are all speculations. And we have to speculate when you have ancient history because we don't have a lot of details. I wonder if Socrates, if he is in fact mocking the language of the 30, he might already be viewing Cleitophon as, suspiciously. Like maybe you're a spy of the regime. Maybe you're coming here to investigate, right, and to make a report on me, Socrates. Now, in this connection, I think it's telling that Cleitophon recognizes that he's being scolded, and he reassures Socrates at one point that he's not looking to do him in. Cleitophon says he will be happy to tell Socrates what he said about him to Lysias, so he will learn that, quote, I am not foully disposed toward you. Now, I'm translating this rather strongly. It's faulos echein, right? But I think, so here's another translation. I want to show you that I don't intend to do you dirty, right? That, I think this is, I would suggest that it might be implied, or it might be taken to imply that Cleitophon is in a position to harm Socrates if he wanted to. So let me step back from these speculations and just say this. If I'm right, this really is not just a philosophical indictment of Socrates, which the Cleitophon has read, but also a fundamentally political dialogue. And I think we need to understand the tone of the interaction and the drama of the moment. Philosophy and politics in the age of Socrates met in the middle ground of the agora. The middle ground was certainly more capacious under the democracy, the Athenian democracy, than it was under the 30. But if I'm right about the dramatic setting, this is the end of imperial Athenian democracy. And I want to draw a parallel to today. I think that the uneasy truce or the détente between philosophy and politics, as I'm going to define philosophy or try to define it, has broken down today. And I won't speculate about whether this is also the end of the road for the democratic republics of the West, but there is a problem that is represented by the persona of Cleitophon in this dialogue and the uh, uh, philosophical openness and inquiry that Socrates exemplifies today as well. Now, here's the reason why I suggested that if this is set during the oligarchy of the 30, it's early, because my friend, the historian Paul Ray, suggested in his dissertation that Cleitophon himself was in fact executed by the oligarchs. He simply disappears from the historical record around this time. So if that's the case, this would actually lend the dialogue a rather tragic tone, because here we have this ancestral constitution supporter, this oligarch, Cleitophon. He would have been attracted, no doubt, to the oligarchy, as was Plato, as he writes in his 7th letter. But then if he came to be executed, that sort of gives this dialogue, as I said, a tragic tone. Now, Cleitophon makes a point of telling Socrates that they are alone. And Cleitophon is taking him to task the way that Socrates says Meletus should have done in the Apology. Remember, he says, if you really have a problem with me, you should have come to me privately. You shouldn't be indicting me in this public forum. So this is a faint echo of the Apology, and there are other echoes of the Apology as well. These echoes are amplified. Cleitophon goes around questioning people in the same way that Socrates does in the Apology. So, for example, at 408c, he says, "I went to question those of whom Socrates is said to have had a high opinion. I went to question those who are reputed to be most formidable," he says later on at 409a. And you remember how Socrates says, I decided with the oracle from Delphi, I'll find someone who's wiser than I am. So I went to question those who are reputed to be wiser, or who I thought wiser. Now, something else. Cleitophon says when he starts talking, and he says, "Okay, listen, Socrates. So we're alone. I'm going to tell you what I said to Lysias. So listen." First thing he says is, "I was astonished. I was, almost driven out of my senses, except Platomane, when I heard you speaking like a tragic god on the machine." That's what he says. So here's Socrates declaiming like this tragic god. Socrates breaking into everyday life and shaking things up. Now, look, this is an allusion to the clouds. And remember that in that comedy, the Socratics were presented as enemies of the city. But there's an interesting thing here. In the clouds, Socrates does not declaim to all human beings, right? But this Socrates does. So he says, for example, and this is around 407 B, he says, you talk to human beings like a god from the machine, and you declaimed as follows, right? And then he says, "Whither are you born, O human beings?" Now, I think I want to make the following suggestion that Socrates, if this is true, Socrates is speaking. And let me read what he says, actually, before I make this point. Socrates actually says, or what Cleitophon says, Socrates says, "Whither are you born, O human beings? Know you not that you do nothing of what you ought? You to whom all that matters is laying up riches for yourselves, while that your sons, to whom you will bequeath them, will know how to use them justly, that you neglect. Nor do you find them teachers of justice, if indeed it is to be acquired through study, or if through exercise or training, people to train them and exercise them sufficiently. Nor have you even first provided for yourself in this regard." And he goes on. I've argued elsewhere that one of the reasons that the Athenians weren't really able to make sense of Socrates is that he had a kind of prophetic breadth in the sense like he speaks like a Jewish prophet, from the Hebrew scriptures, and he's attacking injustice here. This picture of Socrates, where he's like the god in the machine and he's declaiming to human beings, "Whither are you born and what are you doing?" This is a very political Socrates. This is what he's talking about in the Apology. Remember when he says, "I went to each one of you like a father or a brother, and I said, why are you caring about money? Why don't you care about your soul? Why don't you care about justice?" I read somebody, I don't remember who it was, somewhere years ago, who said, the Apology's wrong. Socrates never spoke that way. right? Because we have the other dialogues. He's either speaking in private or to small groups and the occasional public. But if Cleitophon is right, then Socrates did in fact speak this way. There's a suggestion that he's just addressing people in general. And I wonder if this might be a suggestion that the tightening grip on philosophizing under the oligarchy kind of squeezed Socrates into the public realm in a new way, right? Caused him to kind of step up his game and just begin addressing people in general, as he suggests that he did in the Apology. Anyway, as I said, Cleitophon said he was amazed at how Socrates spoke. And, I can see it because this would be a moral harangue. And not just a moral harangue in the sense that, I mean, in the Platonic dialogues, we have Socrates starting conversations with people, and then they get into these questions, right? Well, is it just to harm friends? I mean, it's just to harm enemies. Should the just man not harm anybody? They get into the discussions. But the way Cleitophon is presenting him is he's just going out there and giving it to him. Why do you guys do this? Why don't you care about your souls? Why don't you care about justice? Um, so that would be surprising, it seems to me. Anyway, Socrates, in the speech that Cleitophon quotes, claims to be quoting, Socrates denounces the unmusicality, his word is amusia, of the Athenians. And he also talks about not only internal disharmony, but social disharmony. So here's what he says, and this is from 407C to D. He talks about how it is that you neither disdain the present manner of education nor search for people who will put a halt to this unmusicality. And then listen to this. Yet surely it is because of this dissonance and heedlessness, and not because of a want of measure in keeping step with the lyre, that brother strives with brother and city with city, clashing without measure and discordantly, and in the heat of war, do and suffer the utmost. Now, there, when he talks about war, he doesn't just talk about polemos, he talks about stasis. His references to, he says, stasiazusi kai polemuntes. The city is divided. So stasis, of course, is rebellion, revolutionary conflict. And his themes are the unmusicality and disharmony that result from not attending to justice. And then he says the following, and this is very important. Now, you claim, you, the people he's addressing, that it's not from want of education or from ignorance, but voluntarily, that the unjust are unjust. But then to the contrary, you dare to declare that injustice is disgraceful and hateful to the gods. How then could anybody voluntarily choose an evil of this kind? That's what Socrates says. Crucial point. Socrates' argument is that injustice is done involuntarily. The people he's addressing believe that justice is done voluntarily. If it is done involuntarily, then perhaps it can be rectified by discussion. And that is the essential promise of philosophy, speaking politically, right? If we have open inquiry and civil discourse, we might be able to resolve these issues and perhaps prevent injustice. Note, on the other hand, that the claim that injustice is done voluntarily means that some people are wicked, period. They do it voluntarily. Therefore, they should be punished, right? Now, that was certainly the view of the oligarchy. The 30 executed people on this basis, they claimed to know who the wicked were and what they deserved. Of course, they defined this politically, but that's why they went about getting rid of certain groups of people. This kind of essentialism is typical of ideological tyrannies. And I wonder whether we aren't seeing something like this kind of essentialism today. That is, some classes of people are oppressors. Some classes of people, for example, are essentially racist. We hear this in the United States. A lot of talk about white supremacy. Some classes of people, on the other hand, cannot be racist, right? Simply because of their group membership. So again, I think it's what we're sort of seeing playing out in this dialogue maps, at least roughly, onto some of the issues we're facing today. Again, Socrates insists that injustice is involuntary. That means it's correctable by learning and discussion. And that is one of the hopes of philosophy. If it is not correctable by learning and discussion, then it is correctable only by power. But that it is uncorrectable is the position of politics in this dialogue, which basically means that politics in this dialogue, politics, if you're relating philosophy to those people who claim that justice is, a central character of people, that there are people who are wicked and that's it. That means that politics in this dialogue, and certainly politics under the 30, is war. It's reducible to war. What's the alternative to war? Philosophy. Now, going on, Cleitophon approves of Socrates' assertion that people should not use instruments or employ arts if they don't know how to use them. And that includes the body and the soul. And here's a little passage that I think reflects certainly the ideology of the 30. Yes. Cleitophon said, and he's going on and saying, I agree with these things, Socrates. You said that if you don't know how to use what your possessions are, including your body, then you shouldn't use them, right? Whoever doesn't know how to make use of his own lyre clearly will not know how to make use of his neighbors. And whoever does not know how to make use of that of others will not know how to make use of his own or of any other instrument or possession. Now, note here, he's talking about if you don't know how to use your own stuff, you won't know how to use your neighbor's stuff. That's important because here's what he goes on to say. This speech of yours ends finally too, that for anyone who does not know how to make use of a soul, it's better for him to keep his soul at rest and not to live and act on his own. If, however, there should be some compulsion to live, better for such a one to pass his life as a slave rather than as a free man, and to hand over the rudder of his thought as of a ship to another who has learned the art of piloting human beings. Which, Socrates, is the name that you often give to statesmanship, saying that this is the very same art as that of judging and justice. So if you don't know how to use your soul, you should hand over the rudder to others. Now, the 30, by the way, did suppose, certainly Critias, that he possessed an art of piloting human beings or of governor, right? And the helmsman, Kubernetes, that's the root of the word governor. Now, Cleitophon then goes on to say, look, Socrates, this is great stuff. This is truly such as to wake us from our slumber. But I wanted to learn more. So I'm going to go. So then I went and talked to people in your circle. And then finally, I talked to you, Socrates. So he says, then I went to speak to one of those esteemed by Socrates, whom he later describes as one reputed to be the most formidable. More echoes of the Apology, as I mentioned. He asks what the art is that has to do with the virtue of the soul, by analogy with gymnastics and medicine. And the reply from the Socratic he's speaking to is, well, the art is the art of justice. Now, this is important because later it will be said that justice is homonoia, like-mindedness, which is a condition, not an art, although perhaps it's produced by an art. Cleitophon isn't satisfied, however, right? So the guy says to him, oh, what's the art? It's justice. He's not satisfied. He wants to know what the just art produces. And so he says at 409c, that's for that other thing, however, the result that the just man is capable of producing, what do we say it is? Tell me. The same man as before replied, as I suppose, that it was the advantageous, someone else the needful, yet another the beneficial, still another the profitable. This is also an echo of the Republic. Remember how Thrasymachus says, don't tell me that justice is the needful, the profitable, the advantageous, the beneficial, and so forth. You recall that Socrates then says, oh, well, it might be one of those things. It's like you're telling me I can't say that 12 is 6 plus 6 or, 3 times 4 or something like that. Cleitophon goes on and he uses the analogy of carpentry, which produces wooden implements. That's interesting because the question that he says, what is it that justice produces? So this raises the question of whether justice is a productive art. And I guess I would ask, are human beings to be shaped like wooden implements or fashioned through an art like carpentry? I think this is a kind of ideological stance, right? That politics is a kind of production, sorts of citizens that you want. I don't want to stretch the point, this is certainly something, like Stalin, right? The poets are the engineers of the soul, something like this. Anyway, the Socratic held in repute then replied, okay, the product of justice is friendship. The product of justice is friendship in the cities, which it turns out is homonoia. Cleitophon asks, is it based on opinion or knowledge? And of course, this Socratic answer is knowledge. Like-mindedness based on knowledge. Well, that's a mistake. It's a mistake because these are philosophers. They don't have knowledge. But this is how he answers. What is the like-mindedness, I would say, that brings the Socratics together? It's not knowledge. It's the belief that the pursuit of knowledge and truth is an essential human activity, and that pursuit requires open inquiry and civil discourse. So, but now he's in trouble because now the bystanders push the question: if justice is knowledge, then knowledge of what? Right? And according to Cleitophon, they attack the man. Here's what he says. Now, when we were at this point of the argument and at a loss, the bystanders were able to jump on the man, and the word is epiplate. They were ready to fall upon him, right? And this is a somewhat hostile crowd, perhaps. I mean, again, we can interpret it metaphorically, right? But the bystanders were ready to jump on the man. Medicine, too, they said, is a kind of oneness of mind, and as are all the arts, and they're all able to say what it is they have to do with. But as for the justice or oneness of mind you speak of, what it aims for has gotten clean away, and whatever its result might be is anything but clear. Now, I want to say this mistake of the Socratic exposes the vulnerability of the philosophical community, kind of logical trap here. But what I want to say is this inconsistency is called learning, fumbling their way to the truth, right? So we get a kind of honest view of these men who are trying to figure out what is justice. They don't have all the answers. They clearly don't have a smooth account, but they're on the way. They're trying to figure it out. But this learning is a problem from the point of view of politics, construed a certain way. It's a problem from the point of view of politics if politics is conceived as a kind of technical expertise, and that's certainly the case with the oligarchs. They, Critias, if you read the Charmides, he talks about a vacuous knowledge of knowledge, right? They fancy themselves, Critias fancied himself to be a philosopher, and he fancied himself to be in possession of the knowledge of ruling. And I think it's to some extent our situation today. That is, there's a kind of technical model. We have the answers. We're the experts. And on that model, politics supplies solutions to social problems. And I'm just going to say, to me, this is a very inadequate view of politics, because politics is a constant negotiation. And one of the images I use with my students is, I used to live in Oklahoma, okay? And in Oklahoma, they have something called dry rot. What that means is if you have a wooden house and you need to paint the surfaces, if you don't attend to painting the windowsills and painting the wood, you're going to get dry rot. It's going to collapse. Every homeowner knows you have to put energy into the system. And it's the same thing with the house of politics. That's why there are no final solutions, if you will. In fact, I would even go so far as to say, if you think of politics as a technical problem that's going to solve once and for all political issues, then you're actually aiming towards something like final solution. And I mean that in the fullest sense here. That's going to be the outcome. Anyway, Critias or the Cleitophon or the 30 represent the claim to know. The knowledge in question is not supplied by the 30, and that's clear in the Charmides, this vacuous science of sciences, this knowledge of knowledge. Now we're coming very close to the end of the dialogue and close to the end of my remarks. Cleitophon finally speaks with Socrates, and here's what he says to him. Finally, Socrates, I questioned you yourself about these things, and you told me that it belonged to justice to harm enemies and to do good to friends. Later, however, it appeared that the just man never harms anyone, for in all matters, he acts for the benefit of all. So that's pretty much it. Like, here's another contradiction, Socrates. I think what's happening here is Socrates gives him two answers. One is a political answer. Justice is harming enemies and helping friends. And the other is a philosophical glimpse of justice, never harming anyone. And I think this is a summary of the problem that plays out in the dialogue, the relationship between philosophy and politics. The Socratics operate as a community by certain political practices that are unknown to Cleitophon. And that's the philosophical way of life. Their politics, if you like, is people harmonizing in their devotion to the discovery of knowledge. That's the school of philosophy as practice, as a practice. It's the practice of liberal education. This Socratic practice has been institutionalized historically in the institution of the university. But today, I would suggest that the institution of the university, or universities in general, reflect the mentality of Cleitophon more than Socrates. Cleitophon says that either Socrates doesn't know what justice is, or that he intentionally withholds his knowledge from Cleitophon. And he adds that he doesn't believe that Socrates is ignorant of justice. That's not his view. So we may conclude that in his view, Socrates is guilty of injustice. For it would certainly be unjust to withhold knowledge of such an important thing from a man like Cleitophon, or from anyone, but particularly somebody who exercises power in the city. And that would mean that Socrates can justly be silenced, punished. Cleitophon, at the very beginning of his recitation of what he said to Lysias, says to Socrates, listen. Socrates does listen, but he doesn't respond. So here's my suggestion about the end of the dialogue, what it means dramatically. Is it a suggestion that there wouldn't be no getting through to him in any case? Is it a dramatic indication of his fate under the 30, where he was forbidden to talk with people under 30 or to discuss the art of speech? Socrates doesn't reply. Is it because he's silenced? Cleitophon says that Socrates is an impediment to virtue. And one suspects, I suspect, that he proceeded to report this. Or maybe he's already reported it to Critias. The political man, the man who thinks he knows what virtue is, that is the techne of using others, playing their liars, so to speak, speaks in this dialogue. But the philosopher, silenced. So Cleitophon says in the Republic that when the rulers think one last point. Cleitophon says in the Republic that what the rulers think is in their self-interest is in their self-interest. Recall this? And then Thrasymachus says, no, that's not what I meant, right? But Cleitophon's stand is this kind of subjectivism. If a ruler thinks something's in his self-interest, it is in his self-interest. He embraces this kind of subjectivism, which really means that philosophy is impossible or unnecessary. And that's how he solves the philosophical problem. What's the connection between oligarchic politics and subjectivism? Well, I would just say, aren't we seeing this today? We recall in the era of COVID in 2020, we were told to follow the science. Anthony Fauci said, I am the science, right? Follow the science, I am the science. That was the basis for censoring we now know to be truths, such as this virus came from a laboratory in Wuhan, and other sorts of claims along those lines. So I do think the dialogue in sum does have something to say for our contemporary situation, but I'm very happy to hear what you think. So thank you for listening. Appreciate it.